Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics Module 9, Lecture 1. So we spent Module 8 learning the basic facts of money and banking and the Federal Reserve System in the United States macroeconomy, but we didn't really say anything about what the Fed should do, or if you were the chair of the Fed, what you should do to make the economy work well. And now we start that. I want to remind you of something you have seen earlier in this class. This is the supply and demand market for the credit market. The supply and demand for the credit market, where interest rates are determined. And so you have the supply curve, the amount of money that people are willing to lend. We see loanable funds is on the quantity axis. So borrowing and lending money is the quantity, and then the interest rate is the price. And we presume the higher the interest rate you get when you lend, the more people will want to lend. But the higher the interest rate you have to pay when you borrow, the less people will want to borrow. And then there will be an equilibrium rate at which the amount of money people want to lend equals the amount that people want to borrow. And the forces of surplus and shortage should drive us to the equilibrium interest rate in this supply and demand diagram, like they always drive us to the equilibrium price in the supply and demand diagram where the two curves intersect. So that's how the interest rate is determined. Now, can changes in this interest rate that come out of changes in the credit market affect the macroeconomy? The answer is yes. Right? When people buy a car, usually they don't come in and just put $25,000 cash, on the desk and say, here. Usually they buy it on credit over time, which means their payment is paying for the price of the car, but also the interest rate. Now, sometimes you arrange financing through the car dealership, so they just put the loan repayment on top of the car payment, and sometimes you borrow separately from the bank. But either way, the higher the interest rate on the money you have to borrow to buy a car, the more the car will actually cost you. The higher the monthly payments will be, the longer you'll have to pay. And thus we see interest rates, higher interest rates, raise the price of big expensive items that people buy on credit. And lower interest rates lower the functional price of big expensive items that people buy on credit, like houses, cars, washing machines. And then changes in purchases of those things will affect the macroeconomy. Especially since much of the investment spending in the GDP equals C plus I plus G, the I part, the investment part, is financed through borrowing. The president of Ford doesn't usually have enough money in the safe to pull it out and pay for building a big new car factory. Ford is going to borrow the money. And the higher the interest rate they have to pay on the money they borrow to build the new factory, the less likely they are to borrow the money to build the new factory. So high interest rates discourage businesses from borrowing to build new factories, and low interest rates encourage businesses to borrow money to build new factories. And thus, low interest rates will tend to cause a higher I in the GDP equals C plus I plus G. And of course, that's part of aggregate demand, how much investment goods people buy, how many new factories businesses buy is part of aggregate demand. So now let's say that for some reason, we won't worry about the reason yet, but just for some reason, there's an increase in the amount of money that banks have available for lending. This is an increase in supply in the credit market. So you see we have our supply and demand diagram, and increase in supply, and I hope you remember what an increase in supply does, right? It drives down the price and increases quantity, or in this case, drives down the interest rate and increases the amount of borrowing. Because if banks have more to lend suddenly, if they keep trying to loan at the old interest rate, they won't have enough borrowers to borrow that additional money for lending. They'll have to lower the interest rate to attract new borrowers to get rid of the extra money they have. And this is just, surplus at I1. With the supply curve 2, there'd be a surplus. And the surplus of banks competing against each other to loan out these additional funds will drive interest rates down until interest rates get to I2. And then there'll be enough more borrowing at the lower interest rate to borrow up the additional money that banks want to lend. So in one sense, a little complicated. In another sense, actually very simple. All the way back in Module 2, we learned an increase in supply drives down price and increases quantity. And it looked exactly like this. Now, when people borrow money, that extra borrowing that was going on, people don't borrow money from banks and then put it under the mattress and think, I wonder if anything will show up I want to buy. They almost always have in mind something they want to buy. They want to buy a car if they're a consumer. They want to buy a new factory, or pay for building a new factory if they are a business. And thus this extra borrowing causes additional buying. And how do we show additional buying on our old friend, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram? It's what you'd expect. Additional buying is aggregate demand moving to the right. And you see here we're moving from an equilibrium of P1 and Q1 to P2 and Q2. Now, if Q1 is in the recessionary gap, as it is on this diagram because it's so much less than Qn, we see that this move to the right of aggregate demand could help get us out of the recession. We don't have to sit around and wait for the long run of wages to adjust. We can get out of the recession in the short run, even before wages adjust, by having aggregate demand move to the right. Suddenly the stores have customers again from the money that people borrowed from the additional money that banks had to lend. And they had an incentive to borrow it because the interest rate on borrowing it was less than before. So we see that it might be very helpful for the macroeconomy that's stuck in a recession, for the banks to suddenly have extra money to loan out to people to go to the store and buy things so the stores have customers again. But we ask ourselves, where would this extra money that the banks suddenly have for lending come from? And I hope you suspect the answer, because last module we spent a lot of time talking about the role of the Federal Reserve in the banking system and the details of, as the Fed does open market operations and buys securities, they're creating money. And where is that money showing up first? That's right, showing up first in bank vaults. Because the Fed buys Treasury bonds, Treasury bills, United States Treasury bonds or Treasury bills from the banks. And then they pay for that with created cash, and the created cash goes into the bank vaults that now the banks can lend. Or electronic creation of money through increasing the amount of the deposit of the bank at the Fed has the exact same effect. So because when the Fed creates money, the first place it shows up is in bank vaults for lending, the Fed could do this to suddenly have the banks have more money for lending. So let's run through the process here. We're saying the Fed buys government securities, Treasury bills, Treasury bonds from banks. And why do banks have them? Because when you loan money to the U.S. government, this is what you get, a Treasury bill or a Treasury bond that has the date and the amount that the government will pay you back when they pay back the loan. And because banks are in the business of lending and the U.S. government is the biggest borrower in the country, banks tend to end up with a lot of these things. So the Fed buys these government securities, pays for it with cash, not quite money yet, because it's going to be bank reserves first. And remember, cash sitting in vaults is not money, but the banks have more funds to loan. They have more reserves or more vault cash to loan out this additional cash. So you have to lower the interest rate to attract more borrowers. Now you get more people borrowing the new money that's been created by the Fed and channeled into the bank, and people borrow this new money from the bank and go out and buy things You buy a car, Ford buys a new factory, and then there's all this extra buying, moves aggregate demand to the right, and voila, recession over. This is called expansionary monetary policy. The Fed creates additional money, which drives down the interest rate to increase buying. Aggregate demand moves to the right, and that increases output and lowers unemployment. You might remember we had expansionary fiscal policy that the Keynesians recommended, which was also designed to increase aggregate demand. If you say, what is the difference? Well, Keynesian expansionary policy did not create new money. It was based on the idea of borrowing money that already existed that Keynesians thought was not being spent. The U.S. government borrows it out of people's cookie jars and spends it. Here we're actually creating additional money. The money that is spent is new money, not existing money that perhaps wasn't being spent. And when you create new money or lower the money supply, destroy money that exists, that's called monetary policy. When Congress and the Treasury borrow money or pay back loaned money, that is called fiscal policy. But in both cases, you're trying to move aggregate demand to the right to get out of a recession. But what if the problem is not a recession? What if the problem is inflation, because we are in the inflationary gap part of the diagram? Can we get back to Q sub n without inflation if we're in the inflationary gap? Well, not if we just wait for that natural long-run adjustment to occur, and then the short-run supply curve will shift to the left, and we will get back to Q sub n. You can't help that, but we'll get back to Q sub n with rising prices, with inflation, when you're in the inflationary gap. That's why it's called the inflationary gap. If things take their natural course, you'll get inflation. Is there a way to get out of the inflationary gap without inflation? There is. What if instead of waiting for the short-run supply curve to shift to the left because of higher wages, we preemptively moved aggregate demand to the left? That would look like this. And so you see we're in QN in the inflationary gap, and hey, we got out of the inflationary gap, we got back to QN, we didn't even get inflation. In fact, if anything, prices are going down. Now, what would be causing this drop in aggregate demand? No doubt you guessed it would be contractionary monetary policy. The Fed decreases the money supply, and the banks have less to loan, and interest rates rise because there's now a shortage of loanable funds. And as interest rates rise, people back off of buying cars and houses, and Ford backs off of building factories they were planning to build. And so less money, less buying. Now we're going through this mechanism of how changes in the money supply affect the interest rate, but you can always remember it a little simpler than that. Just remember money is used to buy things. So contractionary monetary policy is the Fed lowering the money supply. There's less money, and if money is used to buy things and there's less money, shouldn't there be less buying? And aggregate demand goes to the left. And what does the Fed do to get less, to decrease the money supply? Well, again, I hope you remember from last module, right? They can sell government securities, so they sell treasury bills to the banks. The banks pay with vault cash, and as the Fed gets the vault cash, it's shredding it because it doesn't need to hold on to the cash, because if it ever wants to pay for something later, it just creates new money. The money supply goes down as the Fed runs the money through the shredder. It can raise R so that banks hold more vault cash and play the loan out, get back, loan out game that creates money through creating checking accounts less. And it can raise the discount rate so that banks voluntarily loan out less. Raising R forces banks to loan out less, so they have to meet the legal R requirement. Raising the discount rate convinces banks to loan out less, so they have a safety margin in the vault above R, and they're in no danger of falling below the R and having to pay the higher interest rate to the Fed to borrow money to meet the R requirement. So summing all this up, to fight recessions, the Fed can do expansionary monetary policy designed to move aggregate demand to the right. The short version is Fed creates more money. Money is used to buy things, so that creates more buying. Aggregate demand moves to the right. Businesses have customers again. Boom, recession over. And to fight inflation, contractionary monetary policy moves aggregate demand left. The government decreases the money supply. The Fed decreases the money supply. There's less money. There's less buying. Stores have less customers. With less customers, there's less buying of goods, and prices were rising because of shortages. People were trying to buy more than there was. Now they're not, and the inflation stops. And so do we, because this is a nice, convenient stopping place. So I will meet you maybe in 10 seconds, maybe in 5 days, whenever you choose to watch video 2, but I will see you there when you do it. Until then, take care.